If you're a high performer looking to grow and make an impact, but feeling stuck, underappreciated, and burned out at work, you're in the right place. I'm Melissa Vining, and this is the Job Search for High Performing Misfits podcast. I help high performers leave draining jobs behind, reclaim their careers, and land roles in organizations where they can thrive. Tune in for tips, insights, and inspiration for your journey to fulfilling work that fits you. What if belonging wasn't a feeling? What if it was a science, one that you could measure, track, and use as a competitive advantage? Our guest today is someone who has the data to back this up. Andrea D is a world-renowned organizational scientist and the creator of the Belonging First methodology. For nearly 2 decades, she's been at the intersection of neuroscience and data, helping organizations all over the world turn culture into a measurable competitive advantage. She's analyzed the experiences of thousands of professionals to identify exactly why some workplace cultures thrive, while others breed burnout and disconnection. So today we are breaking down the measurable indicators of belonging and how you can stop guessing and start using science to find a workplace that actually fits you. Andrea, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Melissa. So I'm Andrea D. I'm an organizational scientist, and I essentially study really one simple question that most organizations and leaders overlook. And that question is, what makes people stay, speak up, do their best work, and what makes them quietly disappear? And here's my blunt take for your audience, Melissa. High performers are not burned out because they can't handle work. They're burned out because they're handling environments that cost too much. So the framework that I created, called Belonging First methodology, it actually turns that culture work from a vibe, which a lot of people associate belonging as like a feeling, into more of a measurable condition that uses 5 indicators in this specific order: comfort, connection, contribution, psychological safety, and then well-being. And today, what I was hoping to do in your podcast is just translate that into what it means for a job search, high performer behaviors, how that integrates with belonging, and then how high performers can also stop repeating some of the work experience under a new logo, if you will.
Yes.
If that makes sense to everyone.
Yes, that's amazing. And I know right before we started, you were telling me how all the research right now is pointing towards high performers just being burned out. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Let's start by defining what the research in belonging is actually saying about high performers. I think it's a great place for us to start. And I love the title of your podcast because you're essentially honing in on high performers being misfits. And I think that's a really interesting way of looking at it, because in a lot of ways, high performers are usually people who deliver results. They solve problems really quickly, they think ahead, and they care very deeply about quality, integrity, and impact. And the thing is that the research shows that you're not a misfit because you can't do your job. It's a misfit because the environment keeps asking you to shrink, to soften, to perform, or to play politics to be accepted. And so what happens inside organizations is that the high performers, they become the fixers. They become known as, the reliable one. They get more work, but they don't get enough support. And so what ends up happening is that a lot of high performers are also praised for being low maintenance, right? Which typically means, hey, you don't ask for much and you don't make us uncomfortable, so we like you. But what happens is that becomes abused really quickly, right? So until high performer standards are then challenged by organizations or by a particular, whether that's a manager or a leader, that lack of change. And let me clarify this. You're typically challenged because there is a big change. So there's a big change that happens, and there's a lack of change management skills and planning. There's initiative overload that interferes with your specific objectives. And then also you're looking at workplace culture norms where people aren't recognized for their value or for who they actually are as individuals. And that's when that shift begins, right? That's where that high performer goes, oh, I can't actually be who I am. And I'm going to start editing who I am to just kind of shift into this space where it's not such a burden for me to be in this environment. And so what then happens, it's very natural and it doesn't happen overnight. It's like slow elements where you stop offering ideas, where you're in a meeting and you would have challenged specific things that you know are wrong, but you're like, no, I'm just not going to bother today. And then it actually leads to I'm just going to stop speaking up in meetings. And it's not that you stop caring. It's because the environment is training you that the cost of you speaking up, sharing ideas, or challenging where groups are like, nope, we're moving forward on this. That actually becomes, the cost of that becomes way too high. And so you have two options. You leave or you stay and you quietly disappear.
Yeah. Yeah. And I definitely relate to that because I have experienced that so many times throughout my life, especially as a neurodivergent person, which I think a lot of the group that you're talking about falls into. And that's something that then has a cost to the individual and the company, right?
Absolutely. And so, if you look at the cost, I think, it's twofold. And that's what belonging is as well. It's 50% from the environment and 50% from the individual. And that's something that we've never talked about from an organizational lens. And even from a familial, like from a culture or from a family lens either. And so belonging is very different from fitting in. Fitting in is it's 100% on you, Melissa. If you don't measure up to my expectations and all of the things that I deem to be a good fit or a good person or a good family member or a good team member, then you actually can't be part of my team, family, whatever that context is. So we've never really looked at it from that perspective before. And so what happens when we start to measure when high performers quietly disappear? This is where that belonging element from a science perspective becomes more practical, because that's when belonging is strong. People can stay, they can speak up, they can do their best work. They can also say when, okay, so you want me to change gears, you want this initiative to be prioritized. So what are you taking off my plate? And what most high performers have never said are those words. Right? They
Yeah.
typically will just, it's like pile it on, pile it on, pile it on. And belonging, when it's weak, it means that you can't actually say any of those things either. And so people learn to protect themselves. And the cost of protection is not small, right? So if you look at just simple things like Better Up published in 2025, that higher workplace belonging is associated with a 56% increase in job performance, a 50% reduction in turnover, and a 75% decrease in sick days. And there is reasoning behind that, right? Like from the business case, but more for your listeners, for the personal case. Because when belonging breaks, it's high performers who become high functioning survivors, and they keep producing and they keep producing. And it takes more and more out of their identity and out of their body for them to achieve what they otherwise would have done early on in either the term of their working environment or in their career even.
Definitely. So I know we're going to talk a little bit about how people can find a better fit for themselves and actually go towards a workplace that is going to have that sense of belonging. But since we're talking about that 50-50, I was also curious if you could tell us a little bit more about the individual's 50% and how that shows up and what they can bring in order to help increase their own sense of belonging in that part that they can control.
You bet. So, such a great question and such a great way to kind of look at how we're doing this. If you don't mind, what I'm going to do first is just go through the 5 indicators so that you can start listening to how you might show up with your 50% and how your environment might show up for you. Because the 5 indicators are actually what allow you to figure out, hey, where am I strong and where am I weak? So, what I will say is that belonging is the science that you can feel through these specific conditions. And there's 5 indicators. And I typically look at them in this specific order because they all build on each other. So, comfort is the first indicator. And comfort is not about not having friction or conflict or everything being like, everyone's nice here. Comfort is actually what your brain needs in order for you to feel like you can do your best, which means that your brain actually needs predictability, clarity, and real success factors. What do I need to do to be successful here? So, comfort is about not having to guess what matters to your boss or to a team. It means that you're not having to decode people's mood swings and you know how to win. The next indicator is connection. And that connection is really about navigating meaningful relationships that are built on trust rather than transaction. So I think we can all understand like that word where a relationship is transactional, but it's not friendliness. It's not like we're in a family here. Real trust is built when the pressure or the, as I like to call, the tidal waves are hitting, and you know that you can actually say what you have to say without, being left out of things. So it's really where you're looking at the trust-based relationship beyond transaction. Contribution is the next indicator, and that's where your strengths are used. So it's where you're valued for what your background is and for your perspective. It's where your voice actually has weight. So think of where you have influence or you don't have influence, because when contribution is actually shared, it means that your impact is recognized so that whatever you're giving isn't also taken away from you. And what I mean by that is a lot of high performers continue to churn. They produce, they produce, they produce, they produce. And then what happens is that because you're producing so much, people will take advantage. And it means that you're not always credited for the work that you're done. And so ideas can be stolen, like actual presentations don't have your name on it. You're doing all this work, you're doing all the tasks, you're making this meaningful progress, but you're not getting credited for it. Psychological safety. We've heard a lot about psychological safety. There's like millions and millions of dollars that have been built on this. And I just want to acknowledge that it's only 1/5 of your brain actually going, hey, I belong here. Okay. So psychological safety, that's your ability to speak up, disagree, ask questions, push back, or even be able to admit when you've made a mistake without punishment. So it's not comfort. It's where you have the protection to actually be honest. And then well-being is where we're able to have a sustainable pace. And all organizations are going through massive, shakeups and changes and all of those things. So sustainability of pace is something that we talk a lot about right now. But I want you to acknowledge that well-being, you can't bounce back just from a podcast or just from a meditation or just from an app. I always say that well-being is not a solo sport. And what I mean by that is that if you look at any of the data from like Hurricane Katrina or any of the massive environmental disasters, people recover 40 to 60% faster when they have a social network. Now, that says a lot because we have a lot of organizations that are like, hey, burnout is a problem. Here, we'll get you a wellness app. Have Calm. And it's not that those things are bad. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that, again, it's we need real conditions that allow us to succeed and bounce back collaboratively, collectively. So let me just recap from a really quick place. Comfort, clarity, predictability, success factors, um, connection, trust-based relationships beyond transaction, contribution, meaningful impact, your voice has weight, your credit is fair. Okay, psychological safety, you can speak up, you can disagree, you can admit mistakes, no punishment. Well-being, sustainable pace, boundaries are respected, real recovery. So for overperformance, the things that often get hit first, comfort, sure yeah, you're
Yeah.
nodding, Melissa,
Yeah.
right? Unclear success factors, shifting expectations. You're like, I have no idea what it is you actually want from me today. So can we outline that first? Can we get clear on that first? The second is contribution, which makes sense, right? It gets politicized, credit, voice, influence. And then psychological safety is actually the third highest for high performers, because it often becomes performative quickly. And so you'll speak up until you don't, if that makes
Yeah.
sense. Yeah.
Yeah. I love how you break this down because I think a lot of times job seekers are thinking, I'm looking for a good workplace culture. And we don't really know what that means. And we haven't actually taken the time to define it. And as you say, you can measure it with these 5 pieces. So if you're looking at that as, good workplace culture, how does someone then find that?
Yeah. So let's circle back to your belonging versus fitting in, and then let's look at some specific questions in each of those indicators to help your audience. So let's just go back to belonging versus fitting in for just a quick second. You heard me go through all of those 5 indicators. When you look at fitting in is simply that with those 5 indicators, your environment makes you change yourself in order to be accepted. Okay, super simple. Belonging means that you can be all of those 5 indicators as yourself and still be respected. So fitting in looks like this with high performers: over functioning, over explaining, over polishing. There's a lot of tone management and hiding your individual needs, like what you need in order to actually be successful. And then what it ends up happening, once you're not getting what you need, is that you then begin to play it safe to avoid consequences. So your output is staying high, but your identity starts to shrink lower and lower and lower.
Yep.
So when you look at assessing belonging before taking your job, okay, I'm going to give you 2 questions per indicator, because these questions are the ones that if you have this, you can do amazing and you're not going to start to shrink to fit. So the first question is with comfort is, what does success look like in the first 90 days? Second, this one's really important. What gets deprioritized when things get busy? And what you're looking for here is you're looking for whoever you are interviewing with to give you an example. And if they can't give you an example, it means they don't know. And if they don't know, you're not going to be comfortable in the first 90 days of you actually starting your job, which means it's automatically a mismatch fit,
Yeah.
right? Okay, second question. So imagine they've answered those 2 questions really well. Second question, connection. How does your team handle conflict under pressure? And how do new hires build trust quickly here? Again, you're looking for stories, examples, not just regurgitation of their values or their vision or their mission. You don't want marketing. You want real ways that you know that a relationship won't be transactional. If they give you mission, vision, any of that, you know it's going to be transactional.
Yeah.
Contribution questions. So, how are my ideas going to be evaluated? And how are decisions typically made? And then the second question is, how is impact recognized? How will my work be recognized? Psychological safety is, tell me about a time someone challenged leadership and what happened. If there's only one question you ask, that could actually be it. The second one is what happens after a mistake is made. And what you're looking for in these two is you're looking for where there was protection in some way to actually keep people willing to continue showing up, right? If you think of psychological safety, it is the protection that you have to get through friction or conflict. And then well-being questions are, how do you prevent burnout during peak periods? And what boundaries are actually protected here?
I love it. And I love your focus on having them give you a real example, because that's what I tell people all the time when I'm talking about interviewing. Like, you are also interviewing them and they're asking you for examples. So you can ask them for examples, and it's a really good indicator of if they can actually answer the question. That gives you a green flag. Are there other green flags that you find people might look out for when they're asking those questions and getting the answers?
It's interesting because what I would say is when you're being interviewed, you want to make sure in that experience that they initially frame your interview to make you comfortable. Because if they're making you comfortable in the interview itself, if they're getting really clear on what the role is, what your expectations are, if they're ensuring that they're setting up like this is what we are wanting and these are where we already see from your resume that you align, then that actually speaks. That's a green light in of itself because they're showing up for you. The other thing that I think, even before you get to the interview, is what have they done to support what to expect in the interview itself? And when organizations or hiring managers actually set that up first, especially from a neurodivergent lens, that actually makes people go, okay, I can actually show up and be myself here. Without that, you already know that you're going to be guessing, and you're going to be guessing on questions. You're going to be guessing on what their needs are. And that actually takes your brain out of being able to innovate because you're in protection mode. And so somebody who really wants you is going to create comfort conditions right away. Now, the one thing I will also kind of circle back to, because it caught my ear when you were talking about, making sure that the environment is right. And I think that's a really big piece that we're now in a time period where the environment is super important. 50% of your success comes from your environment. So think about that. If you are not framing your interview from the perspective of I'm interviewing them as much as they're interviewing me, like what you just said, Melissa, then we actually don't ever find out whether that environment is going to help you succeed. And so, if you're not picking that up initially, what happens then is that you're going into a work environment where your coping strategies are always going to be kicked into high gear. Now, what I also find with high performers is that sometimes the coping strategy becomes so ingrained that it actually recreates the same environment from one job to the next. And so, what I will say is that here are some things that you also want to consider and think about. So, high performers are typically lone wolves. So, they like to do things themselves. And if you are the person who looks at a team, recognizes that maybe they're not on the right track, or maybe they're not going to do it fast enough, and you say to yourself, you know what, I'm just going to do it myself, just get this done, you're actually training yourself to continue to be that lone wolf where you won't rely on other people. And that becomes so problematic because then the ability to accept help feels like an exposure, or it feels like a weakness of some sort, when really, if 50% of your success comes from your environment, that means you still, yes, you can be a lone wolf, but We don't succeed alone. We don't succeed in a vacuum. And so we need our teams. And so that's where, you want to kind of think about, is this something that I keep repeating? And so, quick questions like, what's one task I can share this week? What support could make me 10% more effective? Who needs to be more aligned in order for us to move forward faster? What's the smallest safe experiment I can have? From a well-being perspective, it's like, what are my non-negotiables versus what are preferences? Be clear on those, especially in the interview process, because that will actually help you understand, what's going to break this versus it being a generalized, like nobody cares.
Yeah, I love that because a lot of the times we also need to think about what we can control because there's a lot of this that we can't control in terms of the job search and in terms of the workplace and all of those things. I also found it really interesting as you were talking about like oh, I'm just going to do it. And you're training yourself to just continue doing that. The other part of that is that you're training everyone else that you're going to continue acting that way as well, which I think is a big thing to think about in terms of a lot of the things that you just mentioned. But I also wanted to ask you, for someone who maybe is not clear about their non-negotiables, how can they go about getting more clarity? Do you have any strategies around that?
What I will say is that if you're listening and you're thinking, do I keep repeating the same workplace experience subconsciously? Right? I don't think anybody gets up in the morning and goes, I'm going to do the same thing that doesn't work for me again. Right? Like nobody does that. So, what I would say is there's a really quick self check called the belonging breakdown assessment. And what you do is you actually score a person or a relationship using comfort, connection, contribution, psychological safety, and well being. And you can immediately see, is there a gap? What's my gap? You'll see a score for yourself, you'll see a score for the other person. And so that's at belongingfirst.com/belonging breakdown. And if you take the quiz and you see that there is a gap, the second step is actually where you can do more of an in-depth, where on those 5 indicators am I actually falling short? That would be the first thing that I would recommend to people. The second piece that I would say is when you're looking at belonging indicators and you're looking for questions, I would first start just by asking, like, what's one thing that I need to stop doing? And getting clear on, if you actually sit down and just look at something that you continue to see showing up. And it's typically, just like you had talked about, Melissa, where you're training people to rely on you. Maybe that's the one thing that you don't always offer that you'll take care of it. Right? Maybe that's the one thing that you're going to stop doing. Maybe you have weekly check-ins or weekly meetings, and instead of you being the first person to offer up, I'll help you with that, I'll do that, you actually just sit there and you count to 10. Literally count to 10. And what that does is it actually prevents you from raising your hand because you're so conditioned to raise your hand. The other thing I would highly encourage people to do is, what's the one thing that I'm often misunderstood for behaving, saying, or showing up as or with? Getting clear on places where you might be sending mixed messages is actually a really important piece around you also recognizing your own emotional and social intelligence. And that actually allows you to be better understood. Because if you're not really clear on places where you might be confusing people, you also then can't tell anybody how to get out of it. Does that make sense? Um, Imagine like you're always contributing, but nobody is ever putting your name on documents. You then eventually get frustrated and you opt out. So, just a really easy one to recognize. That can be confusing to people as to, like, why has this person always been opting in and doing all of this work and then all of a sudden they're not? Having that conversation and saying, what, my name isn't put on anything. And so I'm not getting the fulfillment that I actually am looking for because I'm not being recognized or valued. And being able to name that is often something that we don't have the language for. And so, even though your environment, maybe they actually do care about you and maybe they actually are showing up, but if that isn't named, then a lot of people just take it for granted.
Yeah. And I think it's also important to recognize that every individual likes to be recognized in a different way. So, what works for me might not work for you, might not work for someone else. I know recently on my team, I started asking people, like, how do you want to be recognized? And one person was like, I definitely don't want to be recognized in front of other people. That makes me very uncomfortable. So then it's like, good information for me because now as the manager, I can say, okay, I'm going to go recognize this person in a one-on-one setting.
Yeah. When we're not recognized in a way that we're looking to be recognized or valued in a way that we're looking to be valued, eventually that actually does push us towards the door. And whether it's in an interview in your next, phase, or whether it's in your exit interview, one of the things that I think is really important to put words to is to actually be able to say something to the effect of, you know what, I'm really proud of the impact that I have had here or the impact that I had there. I'm looking for clear success factors. I'm looking for healthier feedback. I'm looking for a place of work where we are co creating our success and that we're able to sustain the pace. Obviously, there's going to be times where we're all in, but that when we're all in, there's also the recognition that we need recovery and that that's done as a collaborative, right? So having some language around that is always really important because you don't want to go into your next interview without knowing how you can still look at, I show up, I am incredibly productive, I am a high performing individual. Well, if you're such a high performing individual, this is what I've heard hiring managers say. And I was actually shocked in my research when this was one of the top questions that came up. Why did you leave? And and so when that question comes up, it kind of shocks high performers because if they haven't thought about that, it actually leaves them leading the interview question with a negative versus a positive. And so if we can, shift gears on that, that's also incredibly helpful for setting you up for success if the interview is one that you want to continue on.
Yeah, and this goes along with what you talk about in terms of confident quitting, right? Do you want to define that a little bit for us and talk about what that looks like?
Yeah. So, we've gone through all of these transitions. I'm sure that the great detachment was part and parcel of what's happening with right now, this um, quiet quitting. There was also revenge quitting. And now we're into the confident quit. And so here's what happens with high performers. And it's certainly much more connected to high performing individuals rather than people who just want to go in and work on a team. So what happens with the confident quit is belonging collapses from a comfort, connection, contribution, psychological safety, and a well-being perspective. And high performers are super intelligent. Let's be honest about that. So you already know, you feel when belonging isn't there, often before you're even able to name it. And so what most high performers do is they start planning their exit well ahead of that exit actually happening. And what's fascinating is that a lot of high performers will start to feel flags before they can actually put them into words. And I don't have enough research on this, but I'm very curious to see if there's a correlation between neurodivergent brains and high performers, because we certainly know that there are many neurodivergent people who are incredibly productive high performers and are just incredibly bright people. So often what will happen then with a confident quit is you've already planned your exit. And so these things start to deteriorate and you stop. Stop is not the right word. You slow how much you're giving to an organization, shift into disengagement, and then ramp up the high performance with your job search. And so what happens then is that you get the next job, and often there's something big happening on the horizon within the company that you're in. And the confident quit is, I'm really sorry, I'm not going to be here and I'm leaving. And so we are starting to see this more commonly, specifically with high performers. It does have a relationship to that revenge quitting. If you think of a couple of really big places where we saw that dynamic, Chrystia Freeland, who, from a Canadian perspective, she was supposed to announce the budget for Canada. And the day before, she did an action of confident quitting because she was not being heard or understood as to why the budget should be XYZ and was not being valued.
I'm curious to see how organizations are responding to the confident quit. I guess that's kind of what I'm processing right now, because it's something where I think I read in some of Gallup's research that a lot of people don't tell the truth in those exit interviews, like you were talking about. Yeah. So are organizations even really understanding what's happening with this confident quit era?
So they don't actually understand it until typically 6 months post that leave. And often they have people who go, oh, it's not a big deal. We'll be able to make this up. But what they don't understand is that the pace, the knowledge, the organizational skills, all of those pieces that high performers typically come with, once those are gone, it actually hits them hardest within 6 months. So it decreases innovation, it decreases retention, because then what happens is that the pressure is then put on the rest of the team. And so when the pressure is put on the rest of the team, and maybe you have, depending on the size of the team, really big teams, you typically have, your top 15% are your top performers. You then have a good gap of 50% that are your B performers, if you will. And then you have the rest who are your C performers. And when those B and Cs have to take over the impact of the A leaving, that's actually where you have more disengagement and you have more retention problems, because people are like, whoa, this is the operational level I was used to working at. And I get it. Melissa was amazing and she's not here anymore. And that's your problem, not mine.
Yeah, that's so interesting.
So it is very interesting to see how the dynamics play out post, but it's interesting because most people don't even understand it until after. The other thing about the confident quit is the confident quit typically doesn't give much runway in leaving. So, for example, you have a manager who hasn't necessarily valued you or acknowledged you, and you go in and you say, I'm giving a week's notice. Or maybe you say, actually, I'm done today. And you have no repercussion. But the narrative on their side is that, oh, well, Melissa just didn't show up. Or, Melissa left me high and dry. And on your end, you're like, no, there were all of these indicators. And so it really does create, like, what I see in my work is having to actually coach managers, having to actually train executives, having to actually look at, these are the things that people are looking for so that they can actually show up. And we have not had to do that up until, I would say, the past 5 years. And there's many things that are pushing that. So generational change always will influence that. Our younger generations are asking for more of that 50-50. It's not just a hierarchy anymore. And it's certainly, the leadership style of dictatorship doesn't land with our younger two generations whatsoever for a number of reasons. But predominantly, people also want to know that they have a voice, because having a voice is actually what gives fulfillment, so that you're not just producing for nothing. There is nothing worse, especially for high performers, to produce and it just like sits there. Like nobody wants that. And
Yeah.
so those are part and parcel. What ends up happening, I would say, from an organizational lens, is it's not necessarily reputationally recognized until that 6 month to a year to 18 months. And that's where the impact starts happening, where you no longer have the talent to drive the change that needs to happen, or you no longer have the talent that's rebounding. And that is actually where we're seeing a lot of industry shrinkage, and where you're then seeing a lot of organizations keeping their A's, getting rid of their B's and C's. And what do you think that does? That converts your A's into B's and C's, because you haven't actually balanced your team.
Wow. That is so interesting. So I'm sure we could go on for a while, but as we start to wrap up, any last words of wisdom that you would want to share for a high performing misfit who's trying to find more belonging, either at their current workplace or looking to change jobs and trying to find a place of belonging there?
Yeah, so I would say the first thing that I will say is sometimes your environment is just wrong. And if that's the case, don't wait. If your environment is wrong, start looking now. And we've got a tighter job market right now. So start looking at where that might be true. We also have this very high propensity right now that when our conditions are not 100%, we are ghosting, opting out, canceling, right? We have this big thing where our ability to process friction, conflict, has grossly shrunk since COVID. And we know this. There's an epidemic. There's three epidemics that are happening right now. We have our loneliness epidemic, we have our burnout epidemic, and we have our disengagement epidemic. And these are not separate problems. They are all part of what happens when belonging conditions fail at scale. And so, if you felt this, it might not be you, it might be the conditions that you keep being exposed to. But before you automatically walk away, start to look at where belonging might be something that you're not offering to others. Because this isn't just a one sided approach. And so, what I would say is start testing comfort, connection, contribution, psychological safety, and well being. Meaning, ask for clarity. Let people know where you're struggling with these things aren't predictable and it's actually costing me more time or more ability for me to be good in my role. When it comes to connection, start looking for where you can put trust in people or give people trust by giving them more of what you're doing, right? When it comes to contribution, tell people what matters to you. Maybe they don't even know. Um, from a psychological safety perspective, look at who is showing up for you. Look at who does protect through that friction or through that conflict, and ask them how you might support each other so that it spreads more evenly across your team. From a well being perspective, I would say look at where maybe you're not giving enough empathy or resilience or compassion to the people that you work with. Everybody has different intersections of identity and different elements that are compounding how they show up at work. If you think about um, your home life, your work life, your community life, those are not separate. They all come together, they're all part of you. And so you don't know what's happening in some people's lives? Where might you be expecting too much from someone through conflict? And where could you just have a quick conversation and say, hey, what can we take off your plate? Or what can you take off my plate? What can we swap with? How can we support each other? That goes a long way.
And we're going to put the belonging breakdown assessment linked in the show notes. So for anyone who wants to take a look at that, they'll be able to find it. Is there any other way that people can learn about your work or connect with you, or what is the best way to do that?
So I would highly recommend checking me out on LinkedIn because that's where I'm most active. So if you just go to LinkedIn and you search Andrea D. Carter, you'll find me. Or check out belongingfirst.com. We're just in the beginning of January and we've got a really big update happening at the beginning of February. So there's going to be lots more resources and things that you can also access from our website.
Excellent. Well, thank you for being here, Andrea. It was so great to talk to you.
Thank you so much for having me. And, let's start building belonging amongst all of our high performers so that we're no longer the misfits, but we really change the way workplaces operate. Thanks, everyone.
If you love this podcast, be sure to hit subscribe, leave me a review, and share it with a friend so we can help more high-performing misfits find work they love. See you next time.